The biofuels production and consumption is increasing due to public policies mandating the use of ethanol, some of which are shown on the slide here. The biofuels consumption is also increasing thanks to the interest shown by consumers. However, not all the public policies mandating the use of ethanol, which you see in this map, are mandatory, and this makes for an extremely volatile market. Buyers to trade, be they tariff or non-tariff buyers, explain why the participation of ethanol export in the world ethanol production remains fairly limited, with around 10% of the world ethanol production being traded, a proportion that has remained fairly constant over the years. But in recent years, developments in the US with the RFS, in the EU with the adoption of the Renewable Energy Sources Directive, and mandates in African and Asian countries mean that more ethanol will need to be traded if renewable energy targets are to be achieved. This panel, which counts with the participation of Mrs. Jane Earley, Mr. Per Carstedt, Mr. Victor de Prado, and Mr. Masayoshi Saito, will look into these barriers to overcome so that ethanol becomes a global commodity. Although tariff barriers are the most commonly quoted sources of barrier to trade, other obstacles prevent from this commoditization of the ethanol market. To name a few, the inconsistencies or the lack of public policies, the absence of common standards for fuel ethanol, and sustainability issues, the latter becoming increasingly relevant. And I would like to ask this question to our distinguished speaker today. Do you think sustainability criteria will hamper the development of a global market, or, on the contrary, lay down the ground for its consolidation by fostering confidence within consumers? I will not answer this question myself, but will leave this to our speakers, starting with Mrs. Jane Earley, who is an attorney and managing partner of Earley & White Consulting Group, a firm which specializes in international trade and the environmental aspects of standard in international law. Jane has gained valuable experience in the implementation of international standards, be they voluntary or regulatory. She has served as trade negotiator for the Office of the US Trade Representative. She served as well as the director of the Sustainable Agricultural Unit in the Worldwide Fund in the US, and as the CEO of the Marine Stewardship Council. She's currently working on emerging standards for biofuels and agricultural carbon credits, and on efforts to address sustainable agriculture in American and international standards. Please welcome Jane Earley.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And also, I would like to use my only Portuguese word this afternoon with all of you and say obrigado. And it is indeed a pleasure to be here. I think this is an excellent conference and will give us the opportunity to raise many interesting issues. For my own part, the issues that I have chosen to raise in this discussion concerns market access for ethanol, not only tariff barriers, but also non-tariff barriers. So, as you know, market access can be limited by many kinds of measures, but the following are very relevant to ethanol. Tariffs, as negotiated in multilateral agreements and regional agreements. And also, most people don't think about classification issues, but of course, goods are traded, each one of them with a specific tariff classification. So changing the tariff classification can also change the way in which some obligations are framed. So market access is also, of course, governed by standards, which are governed by two different agreements in the WTO, both the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures and the agreement on technical barriers to trade. In terms of using standards, most people distinguish between technical standards and what I'm going to call a new area of standards, sustainability standards. And I have to move a little bit. I can't quite see over the, okay, there we go. Subsidies are also important, of course. I'm not going to talk about subsidies. I know several of my, several other participants are. So tariff barriers, as you know, they exist everywhere. The United States has a very hefty tariff barrier. The EU also has a tariff barrier. Many of the countries that are starting to use biofuels and have biofuels mandates also are protecting their markets for good reasons. Tariff barriers have been used traditionally to protect infant industries. Of course, the US and the EU both retain ambitious biofuel mandates, and also other countries do as well. And there are recent proposed changes in the United States to blending rates, which would even increase ethanol consumption. It's been proposed to remove the blend wall, that is, to raise the percentage by which ethanol can be blended into gasoline, increasing the blend level to 15%, although I think it will probably come out a little less, would create more than 136,000 new green-collar jobs and displace 7 billion gallons of imported gasoline each year. So that's quite significant in terms of utilization. I wanted to show you a couple of slides that indicate U.S. imports. And by the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. since I'm from the U.S. and I would be disappointing you, I think, if I didn't talk a little bit about it. These are U.S. imports of non-beverage ethanol by type all the way up to 2008. As you can see, the purple there is not fuel and the white is fuel, so there's quite a lot of fuel in the mix of ethanol imported into the U.S. These are U.S. fuel ethanol imports by principal sources, also through 2008. And as you can see, principal sources include Brazil, but also the Caribbean Basin Initiative countries. And then there's the red is from other sources. And this is U.S. fuel ethanol imports under the CBI quota, the Caribbean Basin Initiative quota. It's a tariff rate quota. As you can see, this goes all the way out to 2009, and the quota is very largely unfilled at this point, and that reflects, I think, some decrease of demand due to the recession. So, in the U.S., there's a debate on the tariff. It is a heavy tariff. There are continued protections for the domestic corn ethanol industry, and but there is also a perception that imports of more sustainable ethanol would be better to meet climate goals, and this is a very active debate that's beginning in the U.S. There's also a growing sentiment that the ethanol tariff should be eliminated, except in the Farm Belt, which obviously wants to keep it, and among corn ethanol producers. And I should also add that other options other than eliminating the ethanol tariff are also under discussion. I was told, in fact, that an important paper from the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute was just released this morning, which has options on dealing with ethanol. So I'd commend that to your reading. There's also legislation that's been introduced to eliminate the ethanol tariff. Dianne Feinstein, a senator, has introduced this legislation. And of course, the industry argues that it should be kept. You'll hear more about that later. Some of the industry is here. Their argument is that so far it's not adversely affected imports, and continued support for the domestic industry is needed, and also that it's an infant industry, and other countries also protect their industries. So the attention to the greenhouse gas feedstock profiles and enhanced support for cellulosic could change these perceptions. It's also important to realize that current U.S. corn ethanol production, for the most part, is not affected by the new rules. Most of it has been grandfathered under existing legislation. So, what are some other tariff issues that are important to the U.S. and to other countries? Well, obviously, the Doha round is of great importance, and the environmental goods and services negotiation is going on there, and there's still, I guess, some possibility that ethanol and other biofuels could be added here. There's also an issue, of course, about whether ethanol is an agricultural good, and the U.S. has argued that it is an agricultural good and therefore shouldn't be in the environmental goods and services negotiation. However, it reports the support as an industrial form of support in its subsidies negotiations, so that's perhaps an issue that it will have to take up. In terms of tariff classification, I wanted to mention this issue because it's a rather odd issue, but I think it's interesting. Fuel ethanol was recently reclassified, and the issue has arisen as to whether sustainably produced goods should receive different tariff classifications. And I think the people who are arguing for this most strongly now are people like organic agricultural producers who would like to get a different tariff classification for their goods and therefore different tariff treatment. But this is also interesting in the context of biofuels, because it could be argued that different tariff classification for sustainably produced biofuels might promote trade in it. So, in terms of non-tariff barriers, I definitely wanted to talk about non-tariff barriers because sustainability is a real live issue here and deserves some discussion. Non-tariff barriers consist of technical standards and sustainability standards. The technical standards include standards more integral to use of ethanol as a fuel additive and as a fuel on its own. And I know that many, many, many people in this audience are very familiar with those standards. You may also be familiar with a tripartite task force recommendation, a set of recommendations in a white paper published in 2007 that recommended elimination of potential trade tensions arising from technical standards. This is a really very good report. I think the U.S., Brazil, and the EU worked together on it, and it deserves a shelf life, hopefully, of more than a year or two. I'm hopeful that the ISO and other agencies will act on it because there are lots of technical standards that could provide real barriers to trade. But there are also a lot of sustainability standards in the works, and those have been proliferating recently. I'll talk a little bit more about them. I wanted to say a few words about the WTO status of these kinds of standards. Basically, as I understand the debate in the WTO, if these standards are used only by private sector actors, they're rather difficult to address under WTO rules, because standards being voluntary in the context of the WTO agreements are governed by a code of conduct for the making of standards. I won't repeat the technical name. And most countries are very reluctant to govern the activity of private sector actors within their territories with respect to the way in which, they're making those standards. So as long as